Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 4. Can you believe where we are in this course? We're almost done. This is the second last module, and I think it's certainly one of the really interesting ones. It's gender, leadership, and intersectionality. So we're well on our way. I've chosen this picture because it represents so much of what we'll be discussing in this module. Several years ago, Rebecca Coulter, who's over here in the University of Alberta regalia, is at graduation with a group of students that we became very well acquainted with over a period of years. She and I were invited to by the Education Board at Walpole Island, an Indigenous community near Sarnia, Ontario, and literally across a short bridge from the small town of Wallaceburg, Ontario, and about an hour and a half from London at Western, to do a study and provide them with a report on their school and how to improve its practices and results. Rebecca and I spent a lot of time each week for several months talking to school staff, the principal, community members, and the high school administration at the high school that the young people from Walpole Island attended. We provided an extensive report, and apparently it sat on a shelf for quite some time because about 5 years later, another team came in to do a report and found ours sitting on that shelf. They read it, asked if anything had been implemented, were told not really, and recommended that the recommendations that we had made be revisited. Among them was a suggestion to develop leadership from within the community to support the Board of Education and school leadership. Shortly after, Rebecca was approached about setting up a master's cohort-based program that would take place in the community, at the university, and online. Not unlike really the program that you're in already. However, the emphasis would be on Indigenous and educational leadership. So this is the group that was a part of it. You can't see them all, but there were about 15 of them. Just a wonderful group. I had just started teaching at the University of Alberta. I think I've been there a year, and Rebecca called and asked if I would be interested in teaching one of the courses that summer. They were taking two, and I said, sure, if I can get permission, I'd be glad to. And so I asked. Everyone said, yes, please do. That's a really interesting experience, and you'll be able to perhaps do something with that experience in your own teaching and research and so on. So go ahead. So I was thrilled to do so. Off I went, and we both stayed in the community and lived in the community for for the time that we were there. And it was really one of a great learning experience and teaching experience for both of us. And she stayed on with the program, taught I think a couple more courses, recruited people to teach in the program, found as many Indigenous scholars as were in the area that would be could be a part of it and had the time to be a part of it, and so so it turned into a really wonderful experience for the students, for the faculty, for the university, and all of the students graduated, and as part of their program, they wrote a paper that then was they changed into a chapter for a book, and that book was published. And so, their scholarship went out into the community and into the wider academic world to be a part of the conversation. So that was a wonderful result of the program too. So this group that you see graduating here demonstrates in so many important ways the notion of intersectionality. That is the compounding of vulnerabilities around race, class, language, and gender, and the possibilities for us and for all of us when there's an opening up of possibilities for these scholars and these students. The authors for this module, I'm going to talk a little bit more at length than usual because I wanted to concentrate more on one of the big themes in this module in the rest of the video. Denise Armstrong and Coral Mitchell wrote a great paper that you'll be having a look at on the work, the identity formation, the struggles, and the conquests, I guess, of two Black administrators principals of secondary schools in a large metropolitan area. I think maybe Toronto, I'm not sure. Coral and Denise are both, Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Mitchell are both professors at Brock University. And so they're relatively close to that whole metropolitan area. And they've written a really interesting analysis of this experience. Denise, who brings a racial identity to that conversation herself, has done a lot of really interesting work around equity, social justice, and particularly looks at the work of vice principals, which is an area that has not received a whole lot of attention in the literature. So she's provided some really excellent work to enhance our understanding of what it's like to transition, for example, into the vice principal's role, and so on. Coral Mitchell is a longtime scholar, has made a great contribution to the kind of the world of ed admin in Canada in particular, but internationally as well, and has done a lot of work, particularly with Larry Sackney out at the University of Saskatchewan, because she's from Saskatchewan originally, and they've done a lot of work around leadership and forms of leadership and so on. Tashika Pillay is a graduate of our Educational Policy Studies program, the University of Alberta, an absolutely fabulous scholar, and I had the pleasure of teaching her in one course, and it turned out that she taught me, I think, probably way more than I taught her. She's really a wonderful scholar and is now an assistant professor. She may be an associate by now at Queen's University in Ontario, and continues to do important work around internationalization, international students, the experience of international students in Canadian settings, for example, a whole range of issues in relation to equity and social justice and kind of globalization. Chris Brunner, whom you've already met in a previous reading, and I think probably one of her doctoral students, Mary J. Gillian, whom I tried to find a picture of. There is none that I could find that exists, and that I know of. The last I found was a Facebook entry that was where she was talking about being quite ill. So I'm not quite sure what the story is there, but she's done a lot of work with students in her work as a student advisor, particularly around issues of gender identity, gender minorities, and so on. And she and Chris, who has also done work in this area, particularly in relation to leadership, did a huge study looking at the experience of gender minority leaders in schools in the United States. And their work is, there are several papers that have come out of that study, and the one that we're going to be looking at, I think, is illustrative around the experience of working across gender identities in educational organizations. Dan Robinson, who is a U of A alumnus as well, in fact worked with student teachers for quite some time in undergraduate student services, and I got to know him quite well in that role. He also taught phys ed classes, and so some of you may have met him somewhere along the line. He was a real presence in the department and a lot of fun to work with, and a really interesting scholar around issues of diversity, equity, social justice. He moved on to become a professor and now leading the teacher education program at St. FX, St. Francis Xavier in Nova Scotia. And he, along with his colleague Ingrid Robinson and Robert White, both scholars at St. FX, and both concerned around Ingrid in particularly around issues of gender and diversity and equity and social justice, which is at the core really of the St. FX education program, have written a wonderful paper, an exemplary paper, I think, in many ways, around using Indigenous methodologies as non-Indigenous scholars, looking at the experience of Mi'kmaq female principals in the Mi'kmaq education system, and talking about their experiences and the kinds of support that were important to them in being successful in the role that they took on. And I think you'll find it really interesting. Across these papers, I would suggest, and this is an aside way, but many of you will have taken 510 or will be taking 510, where you'll be looking at research methodologies and so on. And each of these papers does a really wonderful job of discussing methods and methodologies. And so have a look at them from that perspective as well, because I think you'll find them really interesting in terms of how they describe how they've done their studies. At any rate, all of these authors have a lot to contribute, and I know that you'll enjoy their books tremendously. So what do we mean by intersectionality? And I have got Kimberly Crenshaw's picture here because she was the one who came up with this term originally. But as the history of activism around gender in educational settings demonstrates, it is what Loretto calls a white default. That is, the results of that activism have mainly benefited white, middle-class, cisgender educators. For example, the historical record of activism that questioned the labor arrangements around leadership in schools that privileged white, middle-class, cisgendered men most was opposed by women's organizations like the Federation of Women Teachers, for example, in Ontario, that were primarily women, and the benefits that came out of that activism were enjoyed predominantly by white, middle-class, cisgender women. That is, what white feminism was not as inclusive as it needed to be of the experiences, desires, and hopes of Black, Indigenous, lesbian, immigrant, and so on women. Minority women's voices were being ignored by majority women, just as majority women's voices had been ignored by men in educational institutions. And that was the primary critique, and it was an important one. Intersectional feminists argued that it was essential for advocates to fight for the rights of all women in order to address the painful exclusions that were a part of minority women's history. Kimberly Crenshaw was the lawyer and advocate that came up with the term intersectionality in response to meeting a woman whose case, on the face of it, seemed winnable, but the court ruled against her. I'll read a short section from the book Transforming Conversations that explains the vexing legal issue that left racialized women with no redress in the courts. And this is based on Kimberly Crenshaw's work. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989, a Black feminist legal scholar, in her analysis of a case in which the federal courts, that is in the U.S., dismissed the complaint of African American women who felt that they had been denied access to better jobs. The court ruled that the complaint fit neither race discrimination, because Black men were not barred from better jobs, nor sex discrimination, because white women were not barred from better jobs. This is from Gordon, 2016. This tortuous logic revealed the limits of so-called identity politics and the dominance of a particular orientation that disaggregates social problems to discrete challenges facing specific groups. Instead, intersectionality offered a way to consider oppression across categories in ways that revealed, rather than concealed, multiple layers of exclusion. You can actually go to the additional readings tab for a link to a TED Talk that Crenshaw did, in which she explains the legal issues involved that led her to consider this term, intersectionality. It turned out to be a powerful term that resonated with many who were trying to come to terms with the complexities of multiple layers of discriminatory behavior. And it was a word that was taken up by many social contexts, including education. So I'm now going to turn to a very short video that is less than 2 minutes long, in which Crenshaw talks about the meaning of intersectionality to educators.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that, to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
The poem that Pillay begins her chapter with speaks so well to what Crenshaw describes when considering the experience of students at the intersection of gender and other social identities that threaten to silence them, or students whose identities are not reflected in what they hear in their schools. She writes, "I must speak bilingual, neither one of them mine. I must study centuries of history, none of it mine. I read 1,000 voices, none of them speak to me, not one of them speak to me, or not one of them speak of me. Am I entirely obscure? I see you talk and teach, but I can't hear a word you say." And that comes from Salmon's writings. This poem reflects Crenshaw's remarks that raise some important issues for us as educators about what kinds of schools and educational institutions we wish to be a part of. I suspect that most of us would say we want our schools to be places in which student learning prepares them for a successful future. However, successful might be defined by them, and that they will go on to contribute to making the world a better place. We want our classrooms to be caring and organized for excellent learning opportunities, and we want our pedagogy and curriculum to enable each student to achieve their full potential. So what potentially stands in the way of achieving these goals? There may be many challenges, but Crenshaw reminds us that schools can do a better job of achieving those goals when they understand the relationship between identity, that is, who I am, the way I think about myself, the way I am viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define me. All the parts of my identity and their relationship with history, community, and institution. For me, that was an easy one because the school's activities, curriculum, both explicit and hidden, the language, the social practices, reflected back to me my identity. However, what the articles we're reading for this unit suggest is that those that live at the intersections of gender and minority status, of race, gender and sexual identity, gender and citizenship, and we could add gender and disability, gender and class, often do not see themselves in the everyday practices, the curriculum, the pedagogy of their schools. Further, they may experience racism, classism, homophobia, rejection, and a lack of inclusion. In effect, their history, culture, community, affiliations, forms of knowledge, etc. are simply not a part of the school environment, and they are censured when they introduce other ways of knowing, being, and doing. We have seen this in Canadian schools with Aboriginal students, and we have seen the results of when what Crenshaw suggests is essential for schools to meet the needs of all students are not extended to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. Pillay's chapter makes clear how silencing minority voices, history, knowledge, and identities had a profound effect on her as a young immigrant. It is this theme of silencing that I see in every one of those papers. It might be called being in the closet or something else, but it's arguably a profound silencing that shapes schooling. That shapes schooling for minority students, especially those at the intersection of gender and race or minority sexual identities, or immigrant status, and so on, in often destructive ways. Sadly, we may also see this being played out with colleagues as well who live at these intersections. They live with the same absence that students do, and their valuable voices may be muted rather than included in the grand conversation of education. This theme of silencing of minority voices in schools can lead to the exclusion of the experience, knowledge base, and history that Black female leaders, Aboriginal women leaders, and gay and lesbian educators and immigrant students and leaders can offer and represent a loss to the school community. However, as all of the papers remind us, exclusion, silencing, and other tactics of discrimination that these educators may face also have the potential to cause an equal and opposite reaction that strengthens their determination to become a leader for social justice, contribute to a richer fabric of knowledge in the school through expressing their full identity, and provide a model and guide not only to other minority students who benefit from seeing someone like themselves in their schools and classrooms, but also non-minority children in extending their awareness of many ways of being in the world that contribute to everyone's knowledge and well-being. So as you read your assigned paper, I hope you'll identify both resistance to the experiences and voices of the research participants, as well as the benefits that those voices offer to their school and community. If we want the kinds of schools and educational institutions and systems that Crenshaw talks about in the short video we watched, ones in which each child and young person and adult learner is able to achieve their potential, then each paper in this module provides important clues about how that will be attained. I'm really looking forward to learning from your input on each forum as we explore the meaning of intersectionality during this module, both its challenges and its possibilities. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week and a great module.